why we never challenge the humans. She did not ask for water. She did not ask for a translation guide, a welcome packet, a seat adjustment, or a single moment to collect herself before entering the most politically significant chamber in the known galaxy. She walked through the main entrance of the Grand Conclave Hall of the Galactic Accord, crossed 300 meters of polished sarin stone that had been laid down before her species had discovered fire, sat down in the chair designated for the human delegation, folded her hands on the surface of the table, and looked at me. Not at the chamber. Not at the 47 species arranged in tiered arcs around her, each delegation dressed in the ceremonial materials of their home world, each seat a statement of power, history, and institutional weight accumulated across centuries. She did not look at the great luminescent ceiling that rose 90 meters above the chamber floor and had reportedly reduced the Kreth ambassador to tears at his first session. She did not look at First Convener Orith at the head of the chamber, whose ceremonial robes alone represented a level of political authority that most species required years simply to feel comfortable looking at directly. She did not look at any of it. She looked at me. My name is Veth. I have been a senior observer for the Galactic Accord for 40 years, and in that time, I have attended more formal sessions in this chamber than I can count without consulting my records. I have documentation of 319 sessions, ranging from routine trade corridor reviews to the kind of political events that reshaped Accord membership for generations. I have watched the Kreth delegation arrive in full ceremonial armor and still stumble over their opening address from the weight of the room. I have watched the Pell Collective send 11 rotating representatives because no single member could carry the pressure of so many watching eyes without fracturing. I have watched species weep openly at the closing of their first session, and I have watched species go completely silent for the entirety of session because they could not find words equal to the space they were sitting in. The human looked at me and waited for something to happen. Her name was Helen Cross. She was the sole representative humanity had chosen to send. One person, no attendants, no advisors visibles, no ceremonial dress. She wore dark, practical clothing of the kind that communicated function without apology, and her hair was arranged with the efficiency of someone who had made a clear decision about where her attention was not going to be directed. She was not young, but she was not old either. She was precisely the age at which a human appeared to have stopped being surprised by the world and started paying attention to it instead. I looked away first. I have observed enough species over enough years to know that the instinct to look away from something is itself information. I wrote the instinct down in my observation log and then tried to determine exactly what had produced it. The answer I arrived at, after reviewing the moment several times over the following days, was simple. She had looked at me the way a person looks at something they have already categorized. Not rudely, not with hostility. With the calm efficiency of someone who had entered a room, assessed it, identified the variable most worth watching, and settled on it. She had looked at me because I was the one taking notes. First Convener Orith called the session to order with the formal invocation, which in the Velhari ceremonial tradition required a complete accounting of the Accord's founding principles, the names of its charter species, and a brief acknowledgement of the current membership in order of seniority. This took approximately 14 minutes. Every other delegation in the chamber had heard this invocation many times. Several of the younger observers near me used the time to review briefing documents or conduct whispered exchanges with colleagues. Helen Cross listened to the entire invocation without moving. The introduction period followed. Each delegation rose in sequence to state their species' full designation, their home system, their Accord membership tier, and their stated interests in attending the current conclave. The speeches ranged in length from 30 seconds, for the most experienced delegations who had reduced their self-presentation to its absolute essential components, to nearly 7 minutes, for the Drenathy block, who had brought 3 representatives and allowed all 3 to speak in turn on the grounds that their governance structure did not permit a single voice to speak for the collective without public confirmation of the other 2. When the convener called on the human delegation, Helen Cross rose. She said, human. She said, soul system. She said, same interests as everyone else here, which she described as working things out fairly. And then she sat down. The sound that moved through the chamber was not laughter. It was something harder to name, the specific acoustic signature of a room in which many different minds are simultaneously processing something unexpected and have not yet agreed on what it means. I have heard that sound before. It usually happens when something shifts, when a variable enters the room that was not accounted for in the preparation, and the assembled intelligence of the chamber has to recalibrate without showing that it is doing so. The Velhari block exchanged looks. The Marin sovereignty representative made a note on her document surface. 3 different delegations in my peripheral vision leaned slightly toward each other in the posture of whispered consultation. I wrote, "Introduction complete," for words, no elaboration offered or requested. First convener Orith moved the session to its formal agenda. The agenda was standard for a mid-cycle conclave: trade corridor access disputes, a proposed update to the non-interference statute's boundary definitions, resource extraction, rights along the outer band, and several bilateral disputes that had been escalated to the full chamber for resolution. I had reviewed all of it in preparation for the session and had clear expectations about how each item would proceed. These conclaves rarely produced genuine surprises in their formal proceedings. The real movements happened in corridors, in private meeting rooms, in the quiet 30 minutes before a session opened, when delegations positioned themselves relative to each other and signaled alliances through the language of where people stood and who they stood near. Helen Cross had spent those 30 minutes sitting alone at the human delegations table. The first 3 agenda items proceeded without her participation. She did not speak, did not signal, did not consult any document or device. She watched each speaker with the same level of attention, and she did not shift in her seat, and she maintained a stillness that was not the stillness of nervousness. Nervous beings fidget, redirect their eyes, perform occupied activity to manage the pressure of being watched, but the stillness of someone who is genuinely, completely focused on what was in front of her. I checked the chamber's environmental sensor output during the second agenda item. The room ran cold, as it always did during formal sessions, a Velhari atmospheric preference that had been accepted as standard when their species held the convener position. Most delegations had activated personal thermal management systems. The Drenithi representatives were in layered outer garments. Even the Marin representative, whose biology ran warmer than most, had a heat retention wrap around her lower torso. Helen Cross had not activated any thermal adjustment. She sat in the cold room in her practical clothing and watched the third agenda item resolve without any visible opinion about the temperature. It was during the fourth item, the Harrow corridor access dispute, which involved the communication relay network running through a region of space that humanity had recently begun to expand into, that Ambassador Dravak of the Velhari spoke to her directly. Dravak had been in Accord politics for 40 years, which meant he and I had been in this chamber for approximately the same period of time, arriving at entirely different conclusions about what it required of us. He was not a subtle diplomat. He was precise, which was different. He knew exactly where the boundary of acceptable speech was in any given session, and he leaned against that boundary with the confidence of someone who had helped write it. He had survived 4 decades of Accord politics by being exactly as forceful as the situation permitted and by never being wrong about where that limit was. He looked at Helen Cross and said that the human presence in the Harrow Corridor region was a matter of concern for the Accord senior members, given that humanity had not yet demonstrated the kind of institutional stability the Accord required of species operating in corridor-adjacent space. He said it in the formal register, which meant it was on the official record, which meant it was intended to be heard as exactly what it was, a public assessment of humanity's fitness, delivered by the most senior Velhari voice in the room. Every head in the chamber turned toward Helen Cross. She looked at Dravak for a moment. The moment was not long, perhaps 2 seconds, but it had the quality of careful measurement, the way you might look at something to determine its exact dimensions before deciding what to do with it. Then she said that she appreciated the concern and that she would be happy to discuss institutional stability at length with anyone in the chamber who was genuinely interested in the topic, since it was one she found rather important. But she noted that what was currently on the formal agenda was the Harrow Corridor Relay Access question, and she thought it might be more efficient to address the item on the agenda before moving to items that were not, and she asked if that suited the convener. Orith confirmed that yes, the agenda item should be addressed first. Dravak's pigmentation shifted. Velhari expressed irritation through color change in the neck region, a physiological response they cannot entirely suppress. And the shift in Dravak's case was substantial enough to be visible from the observation tier where I was seated. He said, with the precise control of a man managing a response he had not anticipated needing to manage, that he was not accustomed to procedural direction from a first-session representative of a provisional species. Helen Cross said that she understood and that she was not accustomed to receiving indirect questions from people who clearly preferred direct conversation. So perhaps they were both finding the session somewhat unusual, and could they proceed? The chamber made the sound again, louder this time. Orith cleared his throat in the specific register that, in Velhari formal culture, is the equivalent of a gavel. The session moved on. The Harrow Corridor item was tabled for review by a subcommittee that would report to the full chamber at the next cycle. Helen Cross made a note. I spent the remainder of the session watching her, and I spent the evening after reviewing my notes from the session, and I kept returning to the same observation from multiple angles. She had not been rude to Dravak. She had not threatened him or insulted him or made any gesture that could be formally cited as a breach of conduct. She had redirected him twice, using the chamber's own procedural structure as the instrument of redirection. She had done it in front of 47 delegations and a full observation record. And she had done it without raising her voice or changing her expression or appearing to find any of it particularly effortful. I thought about the gap between what had just happened and what Dravak had expected to happen. After the session closed, I watched her leave. She did not remain to network. Networking the closing period of a conclave session was practically a formal activity in itself. The corridors outside the chamber were where half the actual decisions were made, where alliances were signaled, where private meetings were arranged in the language of who walked beside whom toward which exit. Helen Cross walked to the main exit, paused for perhaps 3 seconds at the threshold, as if a thought had briefly surfaced, and then continued out. I reviewed my observation log that evening. The log was longer than any I had produced for a first session in my career. Most of the entries had notes beside them marked confirm later, or watch this, or significance unclear. One entry at the bottom, written after I reviewed the session recording at threefold speed, said simply, she did not blink once during the Dravak exchange. I checked the recording. She had blinked twice. I confirmed this by reviewing the recording at standard speed, frame by frame, through the relevant section. Twice, in 47 minutes of direct eye contact with one of the most politically powerful figures in the Accord. Within normal human frequency for mild attentive focus, according to the biological survey I pulled afterward. But in the room, in the moment, it had not registered as twice. It had registered as not at all. I filed my preliminary session report that night. My supervisor read the summary the following morning and told me that I was being dramatic and that the human representative had simply been confident, and that confidence was not unusual in a first session appearance by a species with something to prove. I told him that in 40 years, I had never seen confidence look quite like that. He told me to write my report and stop theorizing. I wrote my report. I did not stop theorizing. I was not able to stop because the session recording was on my display and her face was on the recording, and every time I reviewed it, I kept finding the same thing, which was that she had never once looked uncertain. Not once. Not for a fraction of a second in the entire session. She had looked at the chamber, and at Dravak, and at the convener, and at me, with the same quality throughout, the quality of someone who had already decided that the room did not require her to be anything other than what she was. That, in my experience, was not confidence. Confidence could be shaken. That was something else. The dominance trial was not something the Accord engaged lightly, and it was not something any senior member had proposed against an incoming species in over a century. It was old in the way that very few Accord mechanisms were old, older than the current constitutional framework, older than most of the member species' documented histories, dating to the period when interstellar contact was new and the question of which species belonged at a governing table was not resolved through application forms and review panels. It had been formally retired from mandatory use 3 centuries ago, after the last catastrophic failure had ended with a species leaving the chamber permanently and not through the door. But it had never been removed from the statutes. It sat in the legal foundation of the Accord the way certain things sit in foundations, load-bearing, largely ignored, accessible to anyone who knew where to look. Ambassador Dravac proposed it on the 3rd day of the conclave. He did it correctly, which was the most alarming part. He cited the specific statute. He cited the provision that allowed a block of 3 or more senior members to formally request a trial for any species seeking expanded operational rights in a court-adjacent space. He cited the Harrow corridor access dispute as the qualifying condition. He noted that the Velhari hierarchy, the Marin sovereignty, and the Goric combined had jointly agreed to submit the request. He said all of this in the measured, procedurally precise language of a man who had spent considerable time preparing the move and was watching it land exactly where he had aimed it. I watched Helen Cross receive the formal notification on the small device she kept beside her at the table. She read it. She set the device down. She looked up at Dravac. The chamber waited. She said yes. Not, we will need to consult with our government. Not, we request time to review the conditions. Not, we would like to propose an alternative mechanism. She said yes in the same tone she had used to say good morning to the station attendant who had opened the chamber doors 40 minutes earlier, which I had also noted in my log because it was the same tone, which meant it was not a performance of calm, but an actual state of it. And she said it within approximately 4 seconds of receiving the notification, which was not enough time to have consulted anyone beyond her own assessment of the situation. I looked around the chamber. Dravac's expression had not changed, which told me he had prepared for acceptance. What he had not prepared for was the specific quality of the acceptance, the speed of it, the absence of any visible calculation, the fact that she had not even looked at the notification again after reading it once. The chamber erupted in the way that formal diplomatic chambers erupt, not loudly, because these were individuals who had trained for decades to manage visible response, but with the particular kind of controlled chaos that happens when 80 minds simultaneously try to process a variable that their models had not accounted for. There were whispered side conversations and the rapid exchange of written messages and the specific collective stillness that happens when everyone is very actively pretending to be calm. The Accord's Exercise Coordination Office contacted the human delegation within the hour to establish trial terms and request a force manifest, the accounting of what military assets humanity would deploy. Helen Cross submitted the manifest the following morning. 7 soldiers. The Coordination Office flagged the manifest as a formatting error and sent it back for confirmation. Helen Cross confirmed it. The office ran the confirmation through a senior review panel, which determined that the manifest was technically compliant with all trial statutes and that there was no regulatory basis to require a larger force. The panel's report noted, in an additional comment that I later obtained through my observer documentation access, that the relevant statute specified that the challenged species could field any assets they chose, and that the document had been written in an era when the assumption of adequacy would have been considered so obvious as not to require stating. Nobody had anticipated needing to state it. The trial was scheduled for the following cycle. I applied for observation bay access and was approved under my documentation mandate. I then reviewed every available record of previous dominance trials that I could access, which took most of one night. 14 trials in the past 4 centuries. 14 challenged species. 3 had survived the 6-hour duration requirement. None had achieved decisive strategic advantage. The record for longest survival before decisive loss belonged to the Aerith Confederation, who had lasted 5 hours and 42 minutes against a 2-species coalition in a trial that was now studied in Accord military analysis programs as an example of extraordinary effort under impossible conditions. The humans were going in with 7 people. I found the human military personnel records available in the Accord's provisional member data system. which only contained the information humanity had voluntarily submitted. The 7 individuals were listed with their designations and a brief service summary. Captain Owen Graves, team leader, listed as having 14 years of active service across multiple operational theaters, with a notation that he held qualifications in advanced reconnaissance, mountainous terrain operations, and strategic coordination. Sergeant Claire Holt, 6 citations for field performance, listed as a specialist in close environment operations. Corporal Leon Marsh, whose service file was notably shorter than the others and contained a comment from a superior officer that simply read, "Does not require much supervision." The other 4 had similar records, each one unremarkable in isolation, each one carrying the specific kind of service history that suggested someone who had spent years doing things in environments that did not make it into official reports. I arrived at the observation bay early on the morning of the trial. It was already full. I do not believe there was a single individual with access authorization who had chosen not to attend. The observation bay looked out over the exercise zone, a terrain structure in the Sarin installation that replicated the geological profile of several different environment types across a territory of approximately 40 square kilometers. Mountains to the north, dense ground cover in the central region, open terrain to the south with minimal concealment. The Velhur-Marangora combined force numbered 914 combat units. They entered the exercise zone from 3 separate insertion points, which was standard coalition doctrine: split entry, converge on the target, overwhelm through coordination. The tactical models they had been running since the trial was announced had generated a projected engagement timeline that the exercise coordinators had shared with the observation bay. The models suggested that against a force of 7, regardless of the quality of those 7, decisive loss should occur within 40 minutes. The models were generated by some of the best military analysis systems in the Accord. At 11 minutes, a Goric advance unit of 40 moved into the northern corridor, which the terrain analysis had identified as the fastest approach to the projected human position. The lead elements rounded a ridge formation. The corridor was empty. The tracking display in the observation bay showed 7 energy signatures, and then 6, and then an updated reading showing all 7 in a location that did not correspond to any position the tactical models had projected for a defending force of that size. Several analysts near me began checking their instruments. The bay started to go quiet in the particular way that happens when people stop talking because they are watching something and cannot afford to split their attention. Over the next 40 minutes, the combined force of 900 moved through the exercise zone in pursuit of 7 signatures that did not stay where they should have been and did not move in ways the models anticipated. The humans went through terrain that the tactical assessment had classified as impassable. They did not appear to register the classification as relevant. They separated, moved independently, converged, and separated again, and every time the combined force repositioned to address one signature, the others had already moved to positions that created new tactical problems. I was watching the tracking display so intently that I did not notice for the first 20 minutes that every other analyst in the observation bay had gone completely silent. I noticed it eventually because the silence itself became audible. The absence of the constant undertone of whispered commentary that normally accompanied exercise observations. I looked up from the display. 80 people were watching the screen without speaking. At 53 minutes, the 7 signatures stopped moving. All 7, simultaneously, in the same 2-second window. They had positioned on a ridgeline in a northern sector that commanded direct observation of the combined forces' primary command cluster, the coordination hub that managed the tactical feeds and communications for all 900 units. The command cluster had established itself in a low-terrain bowl, which the tactical models had rated as well-protected. The bowl had excellent coverage from ground-level approach. It had not been rated for elevated observation from the ridgeline because the ridgeline was on the far side of terrain that the models had identified as impassable. The 6 red indicators appeared on the display in a window of less than 2 seconds. 6 confirmed simulated eliminations of command tier personnel. The combined forces coordination structure was gone. Without central coordination, 900 units defaulted to individual tactical response programming. Individual tactical response programming was not designed for a situation in which 6 senior command personnel have been simultaneously removed by a force operating from a position that should not have been occupiable. The units fragmented into smaller clusters, each responding to local sensor data, none of them communicating effectively with the others, all of them searching for an enemy that had already moved. The 7 did not rush. They moved through the fragmented force with the methodical patience of people who understood exactly what the situation was and were not interested in speed for its own sake. They knew where every unit was. They knew nothing was coordinating anymore. They proceeded accordingly, and over the following 18 minutes, the exercise zone status indicators updated with a regularity that, in the observation bay, produced no sound at all. Just the soft update tones of the display and 80 people watching them change. The trial director terminated the exercise at 1 hour and 4 minutes and announced, in the voice of someone drawing on significant professional reserves, that the human team had achieved decisive strategic advantage and that the trial was concluded in their favor. The silence in the observation bay lasted for approximately 10 seconds. Then everyone started talking at once. I did not talk. I was looking at the Velhari block section of the bay. Dravak was seated with both hands flat on the surface in front of him and his eyes on the display, which was now replaying the ridgeline positioning sequence. He did not move for a long time. His pigmentation was neutral. Whatever he was processing, it had taken him past the stage where irritation registers. Helen Cross was at the back of the bay. I located her only because I had developed the habit of tracking her position whenever she was in a space I was also occupying. She had been there the entire time, standing quietly, watching the same display as everyone else. When the result was announced, she did not react visibly. She watched the replay for a moment, and then she looked around the room the way she had looked around the chamber on the first day, and she found me in the crowd, and she gave me a brief nod. I wrote it down. I wrote, nod, brief, direct, no expression accompanying it. I could not determine what it meant. I reviewed it later and still could not. My best assessment was that it meant, you are still paying attention, and I am aware of it. I found Corporal Leon Marsh in the station's common area about an hour after the debriefing. He was seated at a small table, asking a station worker if there was anywhere nearby that served actual food, as opposed to what he described in terms I did not entirely translate, but understood to mean something unsatisfying. He was not reviewing the trial. He was not debriefing himself. He was not processing a significant event. He was thinking about lunch, and he was humming the same quiet, unhurried melody I had heard when I passed the briefing room the night before the trial. I sat nearby and wrote for a long time. The final note in my log for that day said, find out everything there is to know about these people. Whatever the Accord thinks it is dealing with, it is not that. The Accord's information archive on humanity was exactly 43 documents long when I first formally accessed it. 43. I have that number confirmed by the archive system's own index, which I pulled on my third morning of research and stared at for longer than was professionally appropriate. 43 documents covering a species that had been operating between star systems for nearly a century, that had just demonstrated military performance sufficient to end a dominance trial in 64 minutes, and that had arrived at the conclave with a single representative who had treated the entire proceeding the way a highly experienced professional treats a moderately interesting meeting. Most of the documents were administrative. First contact protocol forms, biological survey summaries, 2 of them, both noting significant gaps due to what the survey teams described as active subject avoidance of the monitoring equipment. I read that phrase 3 times. The humans had noticed the drones and moved away from them, not because they were afraid. The survey notes made clear the humans had not displayed signs of fear. They had simply identified the equipment as something they did not want recording them and made the choice to not be recorded. On their first contact with an extraterrestrial observation presence, their response had been operational rather than emotional. I flagged the survey notes and kept going. The biological material was where I started because it was where I thought I would find the least. Biology is slow. Biology takes thousands of generations to produce meaningful change. A species' biology tells you what shaped them before they could shape themselves. And most of the time, that story is one of moderate pressure producing moderate adaptation. Species that evolve in comfortable environments are usually comfortable species. Species that evolve in difficult environments are usually either extinct or very good at surviving. Earth was not a comfortable environment. The biological survey I found in the secondary archive, filed under a planetary assessment from 7 years ago, conducted by a research team from the Marin Sovereignty, was 70 pages long and had apparently never been formally reviewed by any Accord policy office. I read all of it in one session and then sat without moving for a while. Earth's biosphere was a conflict at a scale I had not previously encountered in any planetary survey. Not metaphorically. The planet's ecology had been in continuous active competition across every niche it contained, from microbial to megafaunal, for billions of years. The predator pressure on every species in every environment was extreme and had been extreme continuously. No long periods of ecological stability, no sustained eras where the pressure eased and species could coast. Everything on Earth had always been under pressure from something. Everything had adapted continuously in response to that pressure. And then there were humans. They were not large compared to the apex predators of their environment. They were not fast. They had no natural armor to speak of, no meaningful chemical defense, no venom, and physical durability that was, by the standards of their planet's large fauna, below average. What they had was a brain that had developed the capacity to model the future, to look at a situation and run projected outcomes before committing to action. Prediction, planning, the ability to communicate complex information with others of their kind and coordinate behavior across large groups of strangers, not just family units, but thousands of individuals unified around shared abstract concepts rather than shared genetic relationship. They had survived by being smarter than everything that tried to end them. And then they had looked at each other. Human history, the recorded portion alone, spanning roughly 5,000 years, was a continuous account of conflict between human groups. Not ritual conflict, not the kind of bounded territorial dispute that most social species engage in once they develop enough cognitive complexity to understand the costs of sustained fighting. Continuous, escalating, increasingly sophisticated conflict, conducted across continents simultaneously, using technologies and strategies that each era developed from the lessons of the previous one. Every human war had been followed by analysis, not just by the victors, by everyone who survived. What had worked? What had failed? Why? What those lessons implied for the next conflict. Humans had developed entire institutional disciplines devoted to this analysis. They had built academies, written volumes, trained generations of specialists in nothing but the theory and practice of conflict. And those specialists had trained others, and across 5,000 years, the accumulated body of human strategic and tactical knowledge had become something that had no parallel in the Accord's records for a species that had developed it entirely through internal conflict, without reference to any other intelligent species. They had taught themselves how to fight with nothing to practice on except themselves. I found a military training manual from approximately 5 centuries before humanity's first spaceflight. It was publicly accessible in humanity's own archive systems, which the Accord's research network had connected to through a standard academic exchange agreement. The manual was written for ground combat forces and covered everything from unit cohesion to individual performance under stress. The opening section addressed what the manual called the core requirement of effective combat performance. It said the most dangerous soldier was not the strongest or the fastest or the best equipped. It was the one who had been defeated and had come back. I read that sentence many times. I had been trying to understand why the 7 soldiers in the exercise zone had moved with the confidence they had moved with, not the confidence of people who expected to win, which has a recognizable quality: looser, more expansive, aware of its own display. The confidence they had was quieter than that. It was the confidence of people who had fully accepted that the situation was what it was and were focused entirely on what to do about it. There was no performance in it. There was no managing of visible presentation. There's just the work done with complete attention. That quality I was beginning to understand was not natural. It was developed. It was something the manual was describing, the product of having been in difficult situations and having come back from them, and having done that enough times that the situation itself stopped being the primary occupation of attention. The difficult situation became background. The work moved to the front. I pulled human psychological research on high-stress occupational performance. There's a great deal of it, spanning several decades of active research. The consistent finding across all of it was that the most effective individuals in high-danger roles were not those who experienced less fear. Fear was universal in dangerous situations. The effective individuals had developed a functional relationship with fear. They experienced it, they registered its informational content, and they continued functioning. One study described this as the trained quiet mind, a state in which threat perception did not cascade into the full physiological and cognitive disruption that interfered with complex problem solving. The trained quiet mind could be developed deliberately. Humans had training programs for it. They had been refining those programs for generations. I thought about Helen Cross in the conclave chamber. I thought about 47 minutes of an exchange with a senior Velhari ambassador, and 2 blinks, and no visible disruption to her focus whatsoever. I thought about her nodding at me across an observation bay full of shocked analysts. I thought about the way she had said yes to the dominance trial in 4 seconds, as if the outcome was already a settled matter in her thinking. I thought about the field manual's phrase, had been defeated and had come back. And I thought about what it meant that humanity, as a species, had been doing exactly that for 5,000 years of recorded history, and who knows how long before the recording started. The worst parts of what I found in the historical archive were not the conflicts themselves. The conflicts were extensive and their scale was difficult to process, but scale alone was not what stopped me. What stopped me were the rebuilding records. City after city, culture after culture, institution after institution, destroyed and then rebuilt, and then the rebuilt version assessed for what had failed in the original design, and then rebuilt again better. Humans had a word for the study of their own disasters. They called it learning from history, and they treated it not as a philosophical exercise, but as an engineering problem. Every failure was source material. Every loss was a data set. I filed my research report on the evening of my 3rd day of investigation. 412 pages, with supporting documentation organized by category. My supervisor called within an hour. He had read the summary. He suggested, in a very careful voice, that the report should be classified. I told him that the information in the report was drawn almost entirely from humanity's own public archives, that their military theory was available through 3 Accord research institutions, and that the biological survey I had cited had been filed in an open access category by the original Marin research team. None of it was new information. It was organized information, and organized information had a way of being more significant than its components. He told me he would need to review the full report before making any decisions. He did not call back. 3 days after I filed the report, I received a data access request from the Velhari delegation's private research office. They were requesting my supporting documentation on the Earth Biosphere Survey and the historical conflict analysis. I sat with the request for a moment. Then I approved it, because denying it would have required a reason that I did not have, and also because I thought it was important that the Velhari delegation understand what I understood. It was possible that understanding it would make things better. It was possible it would not. I logged the approval. I looked at my notes. I thought about the phrase "come back." I was beginning to understand that this was not a description of resilience in the way the Accord typically used the term, the ability to endure damage and recover to a previous state. It was something more specific than that. It described a cycle: loss, analysis, return, improvement. Not recovery. Improvement. Every time. I sat with that for a long time. Then I wrote in the margin of my notes, "They're not here as a new species. They are here as the result of everything that came before them. Everything that has happened to them, everything they have done to each other, everything they have learned. They arrived at the Accord as the conclusion of 5,000 years of development conducted under the most demanding possible conditions. We have been treating them as a beginning. They are not a beginning. The message arrived while I was reviewing navigation charts, which I mention only because the contrast between that particular quiet and the words on the screen was enough to make me lose my grip on the cup I was holding. It clattered. I did not pick it up immediately. I read the message twice. The Accord's emergency network reported an active incursion by 3 registered military fleets, Velhari, Marin, Gorik, across the Harrow corridor boundary, engaging human colony infrastructure at Harrow Station. The message used the emergency protocol language, which is designed to be direct to the point of austerity. Incursion, active, human settlement, confirmed casualties. I was in the emergency session hall in 12 minutes. The chamber was already mostly full when I arrived. Emergency sessions convene differently from formal conclaves. There is no invocation, no formal introduction sequence, no procedural warm-up. Delegates take their seats, and the session opens. And the room has the quality of controlled alarm, which is a specific combination of urgency and discipline that trained diplomatic personnel maintain in situations where losing one means losing both. The Velhari block was seated together in a formation I recognized from previous emergency sessions, tightly grouped, facing forward, not exchanging glances. It was the formation of people who had coordinated their position in advance and were not going to show uncertainty about it in the room. First convener Orith opened the session with a request for the submitting block to explain the circumstances of the Harrow corridor action. Dravak spoke. His explanation was not an explanation. It was a reframing, a careful, procedurally competent argument that what had occurred was a protective response to what he described as an emerging threat posture in the corridor region, supported by the intelligence his delegation had gathered regarding human military positioning. He said the term incursion was premature and characterization dependent. He said the situation was developing. He said the Accord should wait for full information before reaching conclusions. He said all of this with the composure of a man who had prepared a script and was reading it under conditions he had anticipated. What he had not anticipated was the transmission that arrived 4 hours after the incursion began. The emergency communications system relayed a broadcast from Earth's Unified Defense Command. It was addressed to the Galactic Accord, marked for all member delegations, and its content was a formal operational notification. It stated that in response to the military incursion on Harrow Station by forces registered to 3 named Accord member species, human forces had initiated responsive operations at all 3 originating home systems simultaneously. Not a warning, not an ultimatum, a notification. The operations had already started. The session chamber stopped functioning as a deliberative body and became, for approximately 3 minutes, something closer to a room full of individuals, each privately dealing with a significant shock. The sounds were different from a normal chamber eruption, quieter, more internal. People were not talking to each other. They were very still, which in diplomatic practice means they are processing something that their training has not fully prepared them for. I pulled up what I could access of the Accord's perimeter monitoring data. The network was thin in the Harrow region, designed for long-range signature detection rather than precise tracking. But the data showed human vessels operating at the boundary zones of all 3 home systems, precisely at the boundary, within every applicable legal definition of non-hostile positioning. But 4 hours had not been enough transit time. I did the calculation twice. Standard military transit from Harrow Station to any of the 3 home systems, at the fastest documented human vessel speed in their provisional membership file, required a minimum of 31 hours. For hours, the human vessels had not traveled from Harrow. They had already been in position, which meant one of 2 things. Humanity had advanced intelligence about the incursion, or humanity had positioned forces at all 3 home systems preemptively as a standard precautionary measure on the chance that something might happen. The first possibility implied that the human intelligence operation in Accord space was more developed than anyone had assessed. The second possibility implied something about how humans thought about preparation that made the first possibility seem almost ordinary by comparison. I wrote both options in my log. I underlined neither, for the same reason I had underlined neither thing on the first day. I genuinely could not determine which was the more significant finding. The session devolved into a procedural debate about whether the Accord had the authority to demand an immediate stand-down of forces that were technically outside all system boundaries and were therefore not in violation of any statute. The legal office's representative provided a summary that concluded, reluctantly, that the answer was no, the Accord's current statutes did not provide that authority in the described scenario. There were several responses to this finding from the floor that I will note only as expressing strong dissatisfaction with the legal office's conclusion. Helen Cross arrived 40 minutes after the session opened. She came in through the main entrance, alone, moving at the same unhurried pace she used everywhere. She sat at the human delegations table. She placed a document on the surface in front of her. She folded her hands on top of it. The convener recognized her. She picked up the document and began to read. I had never heard the chamber that quiet. Not a vote. Not at the close of a particularly significant session. Not when the Kreth delegation had walked out 3 years ago. That silence had the quality of a room holding its breath because the air had changed and nobody was sure yet what the new air meant. She read for 11 minutes. The document was an accounting of every documented action taken against human interests since the day Helen Cross had first walked into this chamber. She cited the unauthorized survey drones with grid coordinates and timestamps. She cited the framing of the Harrow Corridor matter as an institutional stability concern, quoting the Accord session record verbatim, word for word, from a session she had attended once and had not appeared to take notes during. She cited the dominance trial proposal, the specific statute reference, the 2-day preparation window the Velhari block had used before submitting it. She cited the intercepted communications between the 3 delegations. She acknowledged, calmly, that human intelligence had been active in Accord communication channels, and she noted that she would be glad to discuss the specifics of that program separately, but that it seemed relevant to mention in the context of the current session that the communications her team had obtained included authorization orders for the Harrow incursion that predated it by 11 days. Dravak did not move. She cited the casualty count at Harrow Station. 47 civilian personnel requiring medical treatment. She cited the damage assessment. She cited the response timeline and the vessel positioning data and the legal basis for the response operations under the Accord's own non-interference statute, which, she noted, specifically excluded the right of response from its prohibition on unilateral military action. When she finished, she set the document down. She said that humans had a word for this practice, for the practice of recording what happened to you so that it could be accurately accounted for at the appropriate moment. The word was accountability. She said she hoped everyone in the room was familiar with it. She said human civilization had been practicing it for a long time and had become quite precise about it. Then she said, "We do not want this escalated. We want it resolved. We believe the Accord has the mechanisms to resolve it, and we are confident in those mechanisms. We are prepared to stand down all response operations the moment the 3 responsible delegations confirm they will transfer the commanding officers who authorized the Harrow incursion to Accord custody." She looked at Dravak. He started to speak. Orith silenced him. I watched Dravak accept the silence. 40 years in Accord politics. Never, in my observation, accepted a procedural silence from the convener without a protest response. He sat with his hands flat on the table, and he looked at Helen Cross, and he did not speak, and he did not move. He had understood something. Not what she had said. He had heard what she said. He had understood something about what it meant that she was sitting in that chair with 11 minutes of perfect recall and 47 documented grievances organized by date and source and cross-referenced with public records, presented without a raised voice or a change of expression at the end of a process that had begun with a smile on the first day of the conclave. She had been waiting. She had been paying attention and recording and waiting for the appropriate moment. And she had known, with the precision of someone who had studied this kind of thing extensively, when that moment was. I thought about the field manual. I thought about the phrase, "come back." Then I thought, they always know exactly when to come back. The formal hearing process opened 14 days after the Harrow incursion. I was called as a witness. This did not happen to accord observers. Our role is documentation. We are present. We record. We produce reports. And we are consulted as archival sources when specific events require detailed reconstruction. We're not called to testify. The request came from the human delegation's legal office, which specified that my observation logs represented the most comprehensive neutral party record of events spanning the entire conclave period, and that my testimony was required for the complete accounting. I confirmed my willingness. I sat in my office afterward and thought about the phrase neutral party for a long time. It implied that the human delegation had reviewed my records and determined that I had written down what actually happened rather than what I had wanted to happen or what my institutional role inclined me to record. That was, in the simplest possible terms, a compliment about the quality of my work over 40 years. I found it unexpectedly significant. The hearing chamber was configured for tribunal proceedings, three-panel adjudication, drawn from member species with no direct stake in the outcome. The respondent table held the Velhari, Marin, and Goric delegations. The complainant table held the human delegation. Helen Cross was there, and beside her was a human legal officer named Gideon Hale, who was the first human I had encountered who appeared to have specifically considered what the formal occasion required of him in terms of presentation. He had organized his documentation with visible care. He rose and sat at the appropriate procedural moments. He was meticulous and clear and slightly devastating in the specific way of someone who has built a case so carefully that the evidence produces its own argument without requiring him to editorialize. Helen Cross sat beside him with her hands folded and watched the room. The respondent delegation's opening testimony occupied most of the first day. The Velhari legal team's argument was that the Harrow incursion had been a proportionate protective response to human military positioning that they characterized as threatening. They cited the dominance trial outcome and argued that a species capable of that performance represented an inherent risk to corridor stability. The Marin team's argument was closely aligned with the Velhari position. The Goric representative said less than either of the others, which I noted in my log as significant, because less is said when less can be defensibly said. On the second day, Gideon Hale presented the human case. He was methodical and thorough, and he produced documentation for every claim before making it, which meant the respondent delegations had to engage with the evidence before they could address the argument. The intercepted communications that confirmed advanced planning of the incursion. The casualty records and damage assessments from Harrow Station. The positioning data for human response vessels, with the timeline that made the 4-hour response possible. The legal analysis showing that the response fell within accord statutory provisions. Then he called me. I stated my name and role. I confirmed the observation logs were complete and accurate. I confirmed Helen Cross had accepted the dominance trial in 4 seconds without external consultation. I confirmed the trial result. I confirmed that in my professional assessment, the human delegation had maintained full procedural compliance throughout the conclave period. The lead adjudicator asked if I had additional observations relevant to the panel's understanding. I thought about this carefully. I said that I had spent 3 days reviewing human historical, biological, and psychological records following the dominance trial, and that my assessment was that the Accord had made a significant error in its categorization of humanity. I said that the provisional member designation implied a species in an early or developing stage of institutional capacity, and that nothing in my research suggested this description was accurate. I said that humanity had arrived at the Accord not at the beginning of their development, but at a particular point in a continuous process that had been ongoing for hundreds of thousands of years, under conditions that had been consistently more demanding than those faced by any other species in the Accord's membership. I said that in my view, the Harrow incursion had not occurred because the respondent delegations had credible evidence of a threat. It had occurred because they had assessed humanity as a species that could be pressured, and they had been wrong about that assessment, and the cost of the wrong assessment had been borne by 47 civilians in a settlement that had no part in the diplomatic proceeding that produced the decision to incur it. The chamber was very quiet. I said one more thing. I said that on the first day of the conclave, I had made an observation in my log that I had not fully understood at the time, and that I understood it now. I said that Helen Cross had maintained complete composure throughout an extended exchange with a senior Velhari ambassador, in which she was publicly questioned regarding her species' fitness for Accord participation, and that my monitoring equipment had registered no physiological indicators of stress in her responses. I said this was not unusual for a trained diplomat managing a difficult moment in a formal session. What was unusual was the quality of the composure, the absence of management. There was nothing to manage. She was not suppressing a stress response. She did not appear to have one. Not because the situation was not significant, but because she had been in enough significant situations or had trained enough for them that significance had stopped being the part that required attention. I said, the panel should understand the kind of species they are adjudicating. Not because it changes the facts of this case, but because the facts of this case will be easier to evaluate correctly with that understanding in place. The lead adjudicator thanked me and released me. The ruling came on the final day. The panel found the 3 respondent delegations in breach of the non-interference statute. Transfer of commanding officers to Accord custody was ordered within 24 hours. Reparations to Harrow Station were set at triple the assessed damage value. Voting rights were suspended for a period of 5 years. The transfers were completed in 6 hours. Helen Cross accepted the ruling with 1 sentence. She said humanity was satisfied with the panel's findings and looked forward to productive relations with all Accord members going forward. Then she said she had a question about the process for species seeking guarantor status, because if such a process existed, humanity would like to begin it. The panel checked the statutes. The mechanism existed. It had not been used in 200 years. Gideon Hale produced a completed application from the stack of documents he had brought with him, already filled out. The ratification took 11 days. It was the fastest in Accord history by a margin large enough that the archive system flagged it as a potential error. Helen Cross signed the document without ceremony and without any particular visible reaction, which I found appropriate, because she had known this was how it would end from the moment she walked in and looked at the room and decided it did not require her to be anything other than what she was. I attended the signing as an observer. I filed my final report that evening. 608 pages. At the very end, in the section for additional notes, I wrote what I had been working toward for 6 weeks of observation. I have spent 40 years in this work. I have documented the first conclave appearances of 11 species. I have watched species come into this chamber and try to fill the space with noise, with ceremony, with the performed weight of everything they had brought with them from home. Some of them did it beautifully. None of it was as effective as sitting down, folding your hands, and paying complete attention. I have been asked, since filing my research report, what I think the Accord should know about humanity. The honest answer is that the Accord should know what I wrote in 412 pages, and that the summary is this. They're not what they appear to be when they first walk in, and what they appear to be when they first walk in is already considerable. They came from a world that tried to end them for 1,000,000 years and did not manage it. They turned on each other for 5,000 years of recorded conflict and learned from every single iteration of that conflict until the learning itself became one of their primary skills. They developed the trained quiet mind, not as a philosophical achievement, but as a survival technology refined across generations for use in conditions of genuine danger. They read every rulebook they were handed and found the provisions that said what they were allowed to do. They recorded everything that was done to them and waited for the correct moment to account for it. And then they walked into the most significant chamber in the known galaxy, sat down, folded their hands, and looked at the room as if the room was the interesting problem and they were the ones who got to decide how to solve it. I have spent 40 years studying species. I have learned a great deal about how to observe carefully and record accurately and reach conclusions that are supported by what I have actually seen. I believe I'm good at this work. I have never once made the mistake of underestimating a human. Not after that smile. End of record. Accord Observer Veth, retired.